right, Peter Andrews of Culture Wine. We are here today. Last time I saw you, man, we were probably on the dance floor in Mexico, and then next thing I knew, I was like, "Where'd Peter go?" And everyone's like, "Well, he flew out to South Africa at like 3 a.m." And I was like, "Dear God, that must have been a horrible flight." But welcome to the show, and super happy to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks, man. Yeah, that was a rough morning. I basically didn't sleep for 2 days, so I got to the airport very early, was afraid I would miss my flight, so forced myself to stay awake, and then I was just like a total nut job for 2 days until I got to South Africa.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, we have a mutual friend and we decided to have this podcast because I'm super interested just, in food in general. I also have, an agriculture background, but I would say in the last several years, what's intrigued me a lot has been the idea of taste, which I think sommeliers are probably some of the best tasters in the world, right? Besides maybe your top chefs, but then sommeliers are really trained in that. So I find that super fascinating. But why don't you just tell us a little bit of your background and kind of where you've come from and what you're up to today?
Yeah. So I'm the founder of Culture Wine Company, which is the only importer, wholesaler, and retailer in the U.S. that focuses exclusively on South African wine. So we have access to so many different amazing wines in this country, but for some reason, for many years, South Africa has been very underrepresented. So I launched this company to try to grow that representation. I've been in the wine industry for 15 years now, a little more than that. And I started off in kitchens. So I went to cooking school and thought I was going to be a chef, had plans to open a restaurant and kind of this farm to table concept years and years ago. And went and cooked and lived in Italy and realized during those 80-hour work weeks for like a couple of euros an hour, it wasn't a path I wanted to take for the long haul. It's hard to have quality, like a work to life balance. So thankfully the cooking school I went to started us, even as 18-year-olds, at a special license to let us taste wine underage in a class setting. So I was 18 years old, like learning how to taste wine, like analytically and professionally, which most 18-year-olds are. I'm not saying I was good at it, but it was a good start. It planted the seed. And so after I got back from Italy, I decided I was going to switch into the wine world and never really looked back.
Wow. So this is all taking place at 18 years old. Starting.
So basically I came from a pretty poor family, and I learned how to cook because I had a sick father. And so it was either frozen meals for like my entire teenage years or, fresh food occasionally. So that brought me to cooking school. And then, again, as like an 18-year-old, I was doing some wine classes, but always thought food would be the path forward. Then at 21, when I was living in Italy, that's where I realized I wasn't going to do food full time. And that's when I moved into the wine side. Luckily, the part of Italy I was in called Friuli Venezia Giulia, which is like in the far northeast. It's on the border of Austria, Slovenia. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire until World War I. So the influences are like Germanic, Slavic, Italian. So the food and the wine is really interesting. So fortunately, the region I was in is one of the most famous white wine regions in Italy. And so I went to a couple wineries like on days off, and it was just like all these things kind of clicked. And I came back and started doing all the big wine certifications and went all the way up to the last prerequisite of Master of Wine. And I've been mostly in retail for my career since, but yeah, food brought me to wine for sure. And it they're very symbiotic. So having that background is always very helpful when I'm looking at buying a wine, looking at talking about a wine to a sommelier. Like it all is super helpful.
Right. And so, with the food and wine, because wine also sounds pretty intense, at least the training part, but you would say that it was a little bit more relaxed than the food part.
Both were kind of hectic, man. The my cooking school was like very militaristic, and it was good. I needed it. I was like totally a shithead growing up. But I like the school would basically like if you didn't come to class with like a freshly pressed white chef coat with like a T ironed in the back, no facial hair at all. Like if you came with any of those things incorrect, you would get kicked out of class. And if you got kicked out twice, you got dropped. And
Wow.
then you would have to make up. Each class was 6 hours long. And so if you had to make up a class, you would have to do two 6 hour classes back to back for 3 weeks straight. So it was like pretty hardcore. So it kind of forced you to either take it seriously or essentially get out. And so that really actually kind of whipped me into shape pretty fast. And then the wine side, by the time I got to the last level of, I did what's called the Wine and Spirits Education Trust, or WSET. There's kind of two paths you can take with wine certifications if you want to even go that route, which you don't have to. But if you decide you want to, you go like the Court of Master Sommeliers, which is an American-based program. And that's like, sommelier led, restaurant led. And then you can go the WSET, which is London based. And it's really all about economics and like kind of, it gives you, I think, to me, a more rounded education around wine. And I went that route. And so when you go to the last level, it's called the diploma. I was tasting between 50 and 100 wines a week, every week for 2 years. And so by the time that was done, I was like, I'm really tired of wine. I still love it so much, but it was hectic, man. So you have to it's like free throw shooting. If you want to get really good at it, you got to like practice that muscle over and over and over again. And that's like, so to me, anyone can be a great taster. It's just a matter of shooting all those free throws. Basically, dude, I went through this program based out of London called the WSET. It's like a 4-step program that gets increasingly more challenging. And then after you finish their last, which is the diploma, you can go through Master of Wine. And the Master of Wine program is incredibly hard. There's like 250 of them in the world. It can take up to 10 years to pass this thing. You could become a doctor and a lawyer before a Master of Wine. So anyway, I went through all the way through the diploma, but I was tasting 50 to 100 wines a week for 2 years while I was doing that. So it was hectic. It was grueling, but it was also like really amazing and very challenging. I was very lucky to live in California, and it really actually, I didn't fully realize that until I went to South Africa for the first time. And I met with these sommeliers there who were doing this program as well. And they were really struggling to find the wines that they needed to taste to be able to get like a full spectrum of like what Southern Italy was like, what parts of France were like, what parts of California were like. Whereas like I could call a distributor who was focused entirely on Italy and get some of the rarest kind of Italian wines the next day. And so I was incredibly, incredibly fortunate to be able to taste and taste and taste wines from all over the world constantly. So that was a long process. I finished that in 2018 and have been, continuing on the wine path since.
Wow, interesting. I mean, 100 to 200 wines a week. I mean, sounds like a blur in multiple dimensions at one point. I mean, not only in taste, but even, I mean, I'm sure you're drinking small amounts if you can.
Well, you got to spit, dude. I would
oh, that's right.
For like 2 years straight.
That's right. That's right. Okay. See, I learned something there. You don't drink every sip or you'd be just hammered the whole time.
Oh man.
So, I mean, I'm curious on the taste side of this in this part. So is there someone who's kind of right there over your shoulder explaining the components of taste to you when you're doing that type of thing? Or is it a lot of it just individual and you're trying to figure it out? Or how does that work?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. It's definitely like on you to put in the time and to like try to get it. But like, if you don't know what a guava tastes like, how the hell could you possibly pick it out in a wine, Like if you live in Kansas, you probably don't have access to tropical fruit very easily. And that is, these kind of things are elements of wine. And so I think the best, so basically these programs are offered by different schools around the world, and the best ones will find ways for the teachers to help you grasp what these flavor profiles are. But then a lot of it does come down to, like, you just kind of start to memorize, like, well, Sauvignon Blanc often has tropical fruit flavors while Chardonnay does not. And then you start to kind of break it down. But for me, what I always recommend, I teach classes now for that program, the WSET, and also teach some consumer classes. And honestly, what I always recommend is just, like, when you go to the farmer's market, when you go to your grocery store, like, pick things up and smell them, or when you're cooking, pay attention. And I think that's a big part of it, is it actually forces you to be more present. It's easy to just, like, eat and drink and just, like, go through life and not really pay attention to smell and taste. But when you actually, like, kind of slow down and start to think about, like, okay, I'm eating a green apple or I'm eating a red apple. Why do they taste so different, even though they're both apples, right? And then you start to kind of, like, put that in your memory bank. And then when you taste wine, you're like, oh, this wine has green apple, this has yellow apple, this one has red apple. And each of those means maybe a different grape or a different warmth or coolness of the climate. And you start to, put things together as you pay attention more.
Right. It's super fascinating, because in herbalism, a lot of the work we do is working with people even on their digestion. Most, like Ayurvedic medicine, Chinese medicine, typically the focal point of disease is at the digestion level. It's like we always go there first. And just knowing, we work with a lot of people just on, like, chewing your food, because a lot of people don't actually chew their food, myself included. I'm one of those, like, rapid eaters, right? And so I've noticed, as I've had to chew my food, and then because in herbalism, the taste is actually an indicator of the action that it will have on the body, right? So whether it's astringent or sweet or sour, that tells us how it's going to act in the body. But until I really started into the herbalism path, I was not tasting my food. I was not tasting things that I drink, and just realizing how much I'm missing out on the sensory experience of life and how dull those senses were for me. And I think that's what's so fascinating, because, like you're saying, now it's like, if you want to be good at tasting wine, you actually need to be good at just tasting everything and be present. And I do think it's such a powerful way to bring presence, is just through taste and really it's pleasure, right? At the end of the day, a lot of it is based on pleasure of the senses in a good way with this type of thing. So it's just super fascinating to me, because you guys are like the super tasters.
Well, I'll say there's two things to that. I think number one, what you're talking about is a few steps down the line, right? So if someone's, like, curious about learning how to taste wine, you're not going to start today and tomorrow be a good taster, right? And what it really means is, like, you have to start paying attention, but it's about, like, homing in and, like, honing your skills. And it's like a free throw shot, and, like, if you want to be good at free throw shooting, you have to do it constantly. And it's the same thing. You're just, like, constantly trying to smell and taste. And so I feel like that's a really important part of it. It's in us, right? Like, taste is in us, right? And I think that the second part is like, taste is so supreme, and smell is so supremely tied to memory. And so I think it's so powerful. So I love when I'm teaching a class and someone's like, oh, this reminds me of, like, my grandma's house, or, like, the soup my grandma used to make, or, my dad's, like, red sauce or whatever. And it's like, that's, like, the coolest thing ever, because that smell will be in their mind forever. Right. And so there will be things throughout the rest of their life that happens. And so for me, like, when I first moved to Italy, I was scared as hell. I didn't speak a single word of Italian. I was freaking terrified. And I remember getting to this little village that I was going to live in, and it was May. The entire village had jasmine planted. So imagine getting to a little town and it smells entirely of jasmine everywhere you go. And so now that smell, anytime I smell jasmine, I can find it in wine in, like, a second. And I immediately go back to that, like, terrified, amazing, excited feeling I had, right? That memory. And that is like what smell and taste is all about. And I think that's what happens as you start to pay attention more. Because now you're like, oh my God, this little town smells like this food smells like this apple from this specific part of Washington State smells like this. And now you start to like, it just all starts, the world gets kind of smaller in a really great way.
Definitely. Yeah, we have a huge jasmine, like someone has like a wall of it down the street from here, and it's like when it's on, it's on. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it's like I was thinking the other week of like, wow, smell is so interesting because it's almost I don't want to use the word forceful, but there's no way out of it, right? When a plant wants you to smell it, there's no way you could be like, no, I'm gonna like plug my ears. I don't want to hear this sound. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, you could plug your nose, but when it's in the air, it's right there, and there's no stopping it, which is really
Yeah.
fascinating. And yeah, my ex girlfriend was like what I would consider a super smeller, and I think it made her an amazing cook. She was a very intuitive cook, and she knew how to cook things and prepare them and spices and all these different things. And it was like because I felt like she was such a good smeller, compared to me. And so, yeah, it's all really interesting
I,
stuff. And so, you once you finished your school, and like you said, this school was kind of it's not only the training, but it's also the business side. And the wine industry has like a lot of like any other industry, right? When you look at the supply chain and then the distribution, it has a lot of different components. And so what were you doing at first compared to what you're doing now?
yeah. So let's see, after I got back from Italy, I reached out to a mentor and told him I was all in on wine and was basically asking him like, what directions can you take? Because like you said, the wine world it's really complex. It's a very old industry, but you could go into production, you could go into importing, you could go into distribution, you could do retail, you could do sommelier, you could do a million things. Nowadays, you could be an influencer, right? There's like a million ways you could engage with it. And I wasn't sure which direction to take. And so his advice was keep doing the certification route while you figure it out, number one. And number two, get into retail. And I was like, that's basically, I went and stocked shelves at this like 10,000 square foot, like mega liquor store that mostly sold like jug wine. But it was really important for me because I was like touching bottles. And so, as weird as it sounds, I was like constantly looking at different labels and always moving things around. And like, I think just like touching and seeing the names and seeing the brands over and over and over again was like, super helpful to just like start understanding the scale of the wine industry. And then I started going into more like hand sell bottle stores and kind of going that route. So the last, that was all within Rhode Island. And then I went back to Italy and made wine in the Northwest, did a harvest there. And I remember I had this really beautiful moment where I was harvesting the oldest section of Barbera, this red grape that was on the property. This was at a place called Cantina or Cascina Iuli. It's a small, like natural producer, like an hour and a half from the Barolo area. It's a very like famous area. And he was known for Barbero. It's just this like juicy, low tannin, full bodied red. And it's native to that area. And I was harvesting a section of vines from 1935 that were planted by the winemaker's grandfather. And you always harvest in pairs. And I was harvesting with the winemaker's father. So his father had planted these vines. And he did not speak English purposefully. He barely even spoke Italian. He mostly spoke the dialect of Italian from that area called Piemontese. And I was finally good enough with Italian where I could actually hang with this guy all day and chat. And I remember just like him sharing stories about this vineyard his father planted and how hard of work it was, but how gratifying it was. And just being like, okay, this is 100% my world. Like I am going to be fully in this day solidified it. And it was this really special, amazing day. And it ended up being that the winemaker's father's last harvest, he passed away later, that about a year later. And so it was all just really important to go there, to see a harvest, to pick the grapes, to help make the wine. And then shortly after that, I moved out to San Francisco where I am now. and have been in a couple different retail settings, an import setting, and then launched this company just 6 months ago.
Wow, super cool. No, I really the it's something that fascinated me, and I got such a great opportunity with the almond industry to be able, like, when Mike called me to go do some work for them in India, normally you get trained in California and in the office there, and then you would maybe go somewhere else. But even then, you don't really do that very much in that industry. It's mostly a California industry. Whereas I got thrown directly into the market in India, and I was actually trained as much by the buyers as I was
Mm-hmm.
by the shipper side in California, which was super, super unique. But it like it's something that's so interesting to me in food, because most people don't get the opportunity to see the ins and out of an entire supply chain, which I think is actually like, it's almost like a spiritual thing to me. Like, it's almost like this really important thing to be able to see, like, to go to a farm at the farm level, see the tree without the crop, and then see the crop and the harvest, and then watch it get processed, and then to be able to go across the world and see someone consuming that product, in India, and then watching the supply chain there. It's super unique. So I can really relate in that way of how kind of precious that opportunity is, because it does connect you at a deeper level. And the fact that almonds doesn't have the kind of lineage and prestige as wine. So I can imagine how special of an experience that was, to be with that, something that's been planted by grandfather after grandfather. It's super
Yeah, I mean, and
cool.
I think too, like, in the end, wine is agricultural. It's definitely a lifestyle product. So almonds don't have like people dressed up in nice clothes like walking through the orchards. There's no almond influencers yet, but like there is still it's still a really hard industry. Like, it's hard to make wine. It takes a lot of talent. It takes a lot of hard work and grit, and like it's honestly something hard to do as you get older. It's just like you need like a young workforce. Um, but the cool thing about the wine world is most people who are really serious about it will work a harvest. They will work in all three kind of tiers, from like production to distribution to like selling to the end consumer. And it's cool. I think it's why you meet so many passionate people in the wine industry. Even the ones that are like pretentious as hell and like snobby, like it's usually because they're super passionate, but they don't really know how to actually articulate that in a like a relatable way.
Right.
But it's amazing. So that's one of the coolest things is like I've been really fortunate to travel around the world all because of wine. All over Europe, obviously now to South Africa a lot, all over California, many more places. And like you always have this like easy thing to connect about. And like I was just in South Africa at a table with two guys from Slovakia, two people from Cameroon, a person from Austria, a person from Germany, one American, me, and then three South Africans. And none of us knew each other. And we're all like having the best fucking day. We're just like chatting, talking, like, like all of us didn't have a ton in common, but we also had a lot in common at the same time, and it's like wine. I just looked at the table and I was like, this is entirely because of wine. And how cool is that?
Yeah. No, that's awesome. So before we kind of go into Culture Wine, the company that you've started, tell us a little bit about, when I worked my first job, which was in China. I worked for a small company, an American company, as a family owned like social enterprise, and I sold organic coffee and honey. Um, that came from the south of China, and we were selling it in Beijing and these places. And that was where, unfortunately, I was at the age and I didn't have the diligence that you had, and so I didn't have. It was more of a relaxed startup environment, and so I didn't get to like super coffee prestige level of like tasting coffee. But what I did learn is like, okay, you know, you can't take a crappy grown bean
Mhm.
off of a bad soil or bad growing practices and then do the most amazing roasting and then do the most amazing coffee making and still have a good product, right? It really is about, you have to grow it super well, then you have to roast it well, then you have to prepare it well if you're really going to get this top level type of experience, right? And so tell us a little bit about wine from that
Yeah.
perspective.
So hold on. First off, did you say your first job was in China? That's
Yeah.
amazing. So not just like, working at In-N-Out in Bakersfield. It was all the way in another continent.
Yeah, well, technically, my first job, well, it was like under the table, but like at 16, I was working at the paintball field. That's how I met
Oh,
Mike and
cool.
them. Right? I was actually on duty the first day they showed up to the paintball field when they moved back to Bakersfield. That's
That's
how we all
amazing.
met. But that was like a cash under the table, like 3 day a week, 2 day a week job. And then yeah, my very first job, I moved to Beijing, dude, like 15 days after graduating with a one
Damn.
way ticket. Um, and yeah, it was like this because I was trying to start a coffee company. Okay, so I went to India to study before my senior year, and after India, I went to Nepal because India was so hot that summer that I was like, I'm not traveling the rest of India. This is absurd. And my buddy was like, dude, I'm going to go to Kathmandu next week after the school program's over. I was like, what's the weather like? He's like, it's like 84 right now. I was like, book me a ticket. And so in Kathmandu, I was drinking at points in time, I was drinking some coffee from there. And obviously, a lot of times coffee is associated with like the higher elevation, the better the coffee, right? Like a lot of Colombian coffee in the mountain regions. And I got back to San Diego and I was perusing around the like organic, fancier stores. I never saw Himalayan coffee. And I was like, here's my entrepreneur opportunity. You know what I mean? And so next thing you know, I actually find some random Nepali guy who has like one container of Himalayan beans sitting in the port in Los Angeles. So I get a sample, go through all this. But anyhow, I'm at an entrepreneur meeting at San Diego State and I meet these people and I'm like, yeah, I'm trying to start a coffee company. I have no idea what I'm doing. And they're like, oh, we actually have, a friend who has an organic coffee and honey company. You would be a great fit to go work for them in China. And I was like, let's do it. So that's kind
Amazing.
of how I ended up there. But I definitely didn't get the intense training. It was more like hit the streets and try and make some
It's
sales, dude.
awesome. I mean,
Yeah.
that's like the beauty of life, dude. It's like, just say yes, like take opportunities, like especially as you're younger. It's like just like get out there and just get your feet wet and like ask questions, and it just will open so many doors. It's like it's an amazing thing.
Definitely. It was one of the better, more terrifying decisions I made in my life for sure. Um, but yeah, I mean, so I mean, I imagine wine is quite similar to
Yep.
some of these crops, right? Where it's like the growing aspect, you can't just like grow it well. You got to do everything
Yeah,
well,
dude.
right?
So it's, I think there's a few different paths, like if you are doing big industrial wine, then you're going to spray the sprays, use the pesticides, use the herbicides to like make sure you get the crop, right? Because at the end of the day, for the big guys, it's about the bottom line and about having X amount of volume every year. But the producers I work with, and I think the producers most millennials and Gen Z really care about, are the ones that are more natural and more minimal intervention. And that's who I work with in South Africa. And that's what I think a lot of the better producers in the world are doing. And so they're at the mercy of Mother Nature. And so it all starts with having the right vines and good in the right soils. And that gets really complicated, but to just like distill it down into a very topical way, it's like certain wines do better in certain types of soils and climates, right? It's the same as like coffee beans will do best at high elevation, right? So there's certain climates that it needs, and same with wine. And it's fairly versatile and pretty durable grapevines. You really want to stress them out to make higher quality wine, because the more you stress the vine, the lower the yield. The lower the yield, the better the concentration, and then that yields better wine. But in the end, if you're a producer that is not using the sprays and is really at the mercy of Mother Nature, that means every vintage is a different story, right? And so like a good example of this is I was just in South Africa. We got back last week. And I was visiting one of my producers in this incredible region called the Swartland. The Swartland is like, has been making wine for a long time, but it really kind of found its stride in the last like 25 years. And a lot of these producers kind of came in and realized there's always a beautiful old vines, dry farms, so no irrigation, which stresses the vines out. Again, lowering the yield, but better concentration. It's very dry. It's very hot. It's just an intense place to grow wine. And these producers in the last 25 years or so have really found a home there, and they're pushing the boundaries. They're making some of the best wines in the Southern Hemisphere. And so I went to visit one of the producers I work with called Klein Amoscale, and they own the oldest vineyard of Sauvignon Blanc in South Africa. And it's planted in 1965. It's these bush vines, dry farmed. It's like, it looks sandy soil. It's crazy. And it's all organic. And one of the problems they have there is because it's organic, there's a bunch of like pests. So antelope, field mice, birds are a huge problem, and even guinea fowl. And so if it's not antelope eating all the leaves, which exposes the grapes to be burnt, it's mice and birds pecking at the fruit, and then which exposes them to bacteria. And so all these things create problems when you try to make the wine without adding all these like enzymes and things to help it get through. So crazy enough, this producer who makes incredible natural wine, they had an issue with 2022 because of the fruit not being as good a quality as they needed, all because of vineyard pests. And so these things are just like part of agriculture, you know? And if you're going to make a product that's very much like a story of a year, then that's the risk you take, you know? And so it's not just putting the right grapes in the right soils and the right climate. It's also like tending to and realizing like Mother Nature has a different story for you every year. And that's part of it, you know, that's part of the fun, part of the exploration.
Yeah, it's what makes it exciting in one way, and also just can be absolute catastrophe at the farm level. And it is like,
Definitely.
oh man, I can't imagine like just looking around here in Peru right now, in the valley, in the Sacred Valley here. There's really not a lot of like, the main thing you have would be birds, right? But you don't have any like thing like deer or antelope or other types of animals like that who are interested in your crop, you know, and they're all about it. And you know, actually in Mexico, I think they use, like, if you saw like the maguey plant, that really the much bigger looking agave, it's a lot bigger, but they usually would use that for like a boundary mark, and they'll use that and then hawthorn with its thorns to keep out like deer and certain animals.
Mm,
But like birds can still move through it, but they have all these natural kind of ways of keeping out these certain animals. But it's like you said, I mean, that's one thing Mike's dad just always talks about, is like, you could do everything right that you can do right, but then Mother Nature has always got something for you every year, whether it's a hailstorm
yeah.
or a pest or, you know, whatever it might be. It's a really intense thing. And like you said, it does create kind of a story. One thing really quick, to just not go too far into the weeds, but I have to go a little bit here. Um, you know, I was hanging out with this olive oil farmer in Bakersfield when I was back home, and just super interested to go deeper into that plant and the fruit. And I you know, I didn't realize how important it was with like stressing those plants, and then understanding that the reason the main reason probably that, you know, the Mediterranean is traditionally produced the best olive oils is because a lot of it is dry land farmed, right? They don't have irrigation. And noticing that, like, yeah, it's like if you cut water, like in California, because, you know, some farmers have access to easy water. It's like they'll cut water 2 or 3 months in advance before harvest in order to shoot up the polyphenol content, and then that
Yeah.
gives you different flavors and all these things. Um, so with wine, like, is there certain components that dramatically change with that? Is it like is it certain constituents, or what's changing?
Yeah, so it's very, so wine also is all the flavors you taste are from polyphenols. So um, most people call them just phenolics or phenolic ripeness. And so basically, a grape has like three stages of ripeness. It has sugar, acid, and phenolic or polyphenolic ripeness. All of those hit at different times. So the art is harvesting when they're at equilibrium, right? But Mother Nature doesn't always give you that. So, for instance, I was just in South Africa, their southern hemisphere. So it's March and they're harvesting, right? Our harvest is in the fall, theirs is too. It's their fall. And they had, like, talk about like a crazy year. Their winter last year started with catastrophic flooding, like rains they haven't seen in nearly 100 years. And then roads were taking out crazy, but it built the aquifers back up in a lot of places, right? So that's great for an area where it doesn't get much rain other than in the winter. But then they got this crazy heat spikes right before harvest, which forced the white grapes to get picked quickly. Because what happens with grapes is, you know how grapes are green? They're like these little teeny green berries, and then they start to change color. So when they're flower all the way to green, all they're doing is developing acidity and acids. And then once they start changing color, all they're doing is developing sugar, but the acidity is dropping. And so during that time, phenolic ripeness is starting to catch up to all of that. So you have acidity at a peak and you have sugar starting to catch up and acidity is starting to drop, right? So you're basically trying to get the seesaw to be balanced with phenolics kind of like hanging out off center, trying to like bring it down. And so if you get a heat spike, what happens is the sugar spikes and the acidity plummets, but maybe the phenolics haven't actually caught up, right? And so now
Mm.
you're like, oh shit, do I harvest now and have a grape that's not perfectly ripe, or do I risk the heat continuing and rain coming and it absolutely destroying the vintage? So these decisions have to be made somewhat quickly around, and sometimes saving a harvest. And they're really challenging decisions to make. And so in South Africa, they just had this heat spike that forced a lot of producers to start picking whites. But then the temperatures dropped and the reds started to catch up in ripeness. But the issue is that it's now so late in the season, some of the reds are never going to catch up in ripeness. So they're always going to be a little underripe. And so this is only in some cases, but it's a really uh, it's a very like long-winded way of saying like there's similarities to what you're asking about with olives, and it's really all about understanding like exactly what you're looking for in terms of ripeness in the fruit, and then just in some ways praying that the weather holds up for you, and then that you time it out the right way. It takes a lot of skill.
Right. And so this, when you say, like, you just used a insider term, right, to a layman, when you said like that'll impact the vintage. So is the vintage just like, does that mean like this year's unique compilation of everything that happened which produced this wine? That's this year's vintage.
Yeah, exactly. So even if you're in, let's say you have one contiguous vineyard, right? And let's say that's 20 acres. Those 20 acres are most likely not going to ripen at the same time. There might be like a couple little hills, or like one is facing east, one is facing west. And so they all ripen at different times. And even if it's the same grape. And so what'll often happen, and what I saw happen this year, is like one producer picked one of their reds, a grape called Mourvedre. It's originally from southern France. It creates a kind of like rustic, full-bodied red, but when it's ripe, it's really like textured and fleshy almost. One of the vineyards ripened fairly early, and it was, when you have a lot of sugar, that means a lot of alcohol, right? So it had a decent amount, like a 14% alcohol wine, which is medium plus to high in terms of like alcohol percentage. But then another section didn't get as ripe as they wanted. but they had to pick it because it wasn't ever going to get any better. And now you're risking like rains coming, birds coming, whatever, and losing it altogether. So you got to pick it. And so now you make these two batches of Mourvedre. One is fairly ripe, one is not. And now you're gonna blend those and meet them in the middle. And now what you hope is that the fairly ripe and the like barely ripe create a wine that is well balanced. But what can happen in the worst case scenario there is that it doesn't really work. And now you're tasting a wine and you're like, it's disjointed. I'm tasting really ripe fruit, but I'm also tasting greenness. Like, what the hell is happening? Right. And that's kind of what you're learning how to taste as like a professional. So then when you're a buyer or if you're a winemaker, you're like, how do I avoid that? Or how do I ensure that there's better balance in the wine? And that's comes all the way back to like, this unbalanced wine is coming from the fact that this vintage was challenging and some is ripe, some is not. And you start to just put all those pieces together.
Wow, that is massively interesting. Yeah, because I mean, there's blending all the time with like even with olive oil, right? A lot of people don't realize that if you're buying an olive oil and it has multiple countries on the bottle,
Yeah.
you probably don't want to buy that because that means it's been sitting in barrels versus getting a single origin olive oil, which means it's probably been bottled within like 4 hours of being harvested and pressed. You know, it's a completely different quality and all sorts of things. So, okay, I have one question about that. I mean, do they ever make the decision of, okay, actually this is these two separate, you know, harvests off the same property, like they're not going to blend well together. So do they ever just decide like, okay, we can't use like whatever one that happens?
Yeah, it happens a lot. So if you're a quality producer, your name is your reputation, right? And if you're not happy with it, you'll often say, okay, I have to release less wine to the market this year, which means I'm going to make less money this year, right? And then you would usually sell the stuff off in bulk because there's probably a grocery store brand or something down the street that may want to put it into a larger blend that's so large that your little amount that wouldn't work is insignificant to this, you know, ocean of wine that they're making. So you see that a lot. But the problem is that, like, if you're a small producer, like the producers I work with, that could be catastrophic, right? Like you're like the difference between a profit and a loss is not large. And to them losing maybe a whole vineyard or a whole section of a vineyard because of this that they can't blend in is a big challenge. But on the other hand, I like for a good example is a producer of mine decided not to bottle one of their vintages of red. And it was because the fruit quality to make the style of wine that they need, that they want to make, this natural wine that's native yeast, no sulfur added, it has to be flawless. But when you're an organic producer and you have birds, and another thing I didn't mention is baboons are an issue in South Africa. Baboons like literally go in, and the little bastards don't even eat the fruit. They just fucking rip it off and then throw it. But they'll like destroy vineyards. So in this vintage, there's so many little bastard pests coming in at the very end and made the fruit not perfect. So then this little like spoilage happened in the back end of the production and they realized, shit, we can't bottle this. And so for me as an importer, I mean, I feel for them tremendously because they're a tiny producer and they don't have the means to just let a vintage go away. But at the same time, that makes me respect them times a million because they're not going to put a product out that they can't put their name on. And to me, that is like, okay, I now respect what you're doing even more. And that's like, I got your back and we're working together and we're going to figure out how to like work together for years. And I'll figure out how to support you another way while this vintage isn't going to be around. Right. And so now for a whole year, I'm trying to figure out how to stretch the previous vintage into 2 years, which I should only need one. So you see things like this. And it can be really challenging. And then I think it's my role as an importer and a marketer to try to help continue telling their story and make sure they get through this on the other side even better. Um, but yeah, it can happen a lot, and you see it happen quite a bit.
That's super interesting. Yeah, that does not happen with almonds. We'll sell you the almond dust off the factory floor.
Yeah.
It's no joke. The factory floor is so clean that they actually do suck up almond dust and then make that into a product.
Oh my God, that's
That's
crazy.
not a it just doesn't have, I mean, the yeah, that lineage component, right? That deep lineage and the brand for every single estate. Most agriculture industries don't work like that, right? Like, no one's like, oh, I buy my almonds specifically from this region, from this farm in California. That's something that is unique to really, probably a fraction of the agriculture products in the world. I can think about wine and olive, oil off the top of my head. I know there's more than that, but that's, in general, when you think of agriculture commodities, it is much more of a commodity, and you wouldn't be willing to take as big a haircut in order to protect against the potential damage to the brand. It makes total sense. I can actually almost see, though, like a potential, like, startup innovation where
Mhm.
if you could test at a laboratory level, like, okay, here's the flavor profile of this grape that we have that is not usable with our stuff, and then other farms or other vineyards are submitting their stuff they can't use, and then if there could be a match to bring these two
Yeah.
disparate ones together, that would
I
happen
mean,
to work, and then it would be like, let's blend these, you know.
yeah. I mean, there are like brokerages that do this, dude, in the wine world. There's huge ones here in California that basically like they're so deeply involved in that element on such a major scale that they basically their projections for where the industry is, like where we have too much planted, we have not enough planted, we're overcropping, we're undercropping, like their analysis on a given year is kind of like where the industry is headed. So almost every year there's these brokerages and then some other kind of like research firms that'll say like, okay, California is overplanted by 15,000 acres, or it's underplanted by this. And I think we're overplanted right now to have equilibrium between supply and demand. But yeah, I mean, that's exactly like what you're saying. There are people who like literally do that for their job, and yeah. And
Wow.
I think that's why like on one hand, people are growing grapes. They're risking a lot growing grapes. It's an expensive. And just like I would say the one thing that growing grapes has in common with every agricultural product is that the grower in every sense makes the least amount, right? It's always like if you're the almond grower, the grape grower, the apple grower, you're making less than the distributor, than the retailer in terms of margin. And it's really hard. Then that's why there's so many like little small kind of co-ops that'll take on little small producers to try, or growers to help them try to like make a living out of it. But
Mm.
it's challenging to do that, to grow. And yeah, these, I think, sorry, like going on a tangent, but I think what I was meaning to say too is like, I think this is why people are so interested in like natural wines and these minimal intervention wines, because a lot of these producers, whether they had a great year or not, they're going to put it into bottle. And I think consumers are down to support that, because at least it's like they feel like it's genuine. It is the story of the year. It is the producer like putting their heart and soul into this bottle. And for better or for worse, the quality may be good, the quality may not. But I think that's a big part of what that natural wine minimal intervention movement is.
Right. And so I want to talk more about the natural wine side of things. I mean, I really just started to learn about that in the past couple of years, but I really don't know what it means. I'm not a huge, wine drinker myself personally. So what does that mean? I mean, I think most people for a long time would have assumed that they're always drink like wine is natural, but that's not the case, and it's not the case with most products today in certain places, especially in the U.S. And so, what does that really mean?
I mean, honestly, dude, I think there's a lot of greenwashing, and I think there's a lot of confusion even within the industry. There are some folks who are super staunch about particular aspects of winemaking where they won't buy it. And I think some of that comes from just like a little too dogmatic. But in essence, I think the element of natural winemaking is that it is coming from a vineyard that is farmed organically, either certified or not, or at least sustainably. There is native yeast used. So grapes have a native yeast, like a bloom on the grape that can create the fermentation on its own. Oftentimes that yeast is not strong enough to actually finish the fermentation. So you need to give it a boost of some additional. So I'll try not to go too far down the weeds, but that's a challenging thing. And then usually there's no like enzymes added. There's no like additional kind of non-natural things that like a fermentation would need to finish. So you let the fermentation start and you get it to the finish line. And you should be keeping your winery very sanitary. So no like spoilage yeasts and things can get in and create like off compounds. And then the last thing would be like during fermentation and during bottling, sulfur is probably the most controversial element. It shouldn't be because sulfur is natural. It's a naturally occurring compound. But in the wine world, you often see people say like, I don't want any sulfur in my wines. Sulfur is usually used at least at the bottling to help it as an antioxidant. And so if you want to drink your wine like a year or more down the road, you usually need a little bit of sulfur at bottling to help ensure that it can age. And there are some folks in the natural wine world who think there should be zero sulfur. They call it 0-0. So it's none added during production and none added at bottling. And that usually can create some funky wines with very short amount of time in bottle. So it can get, it's really complicated, as you can tell. But for me, and this is why I think it's complicated, is because everyone has their own interpretation of it. To me, and what I look for is that there's consistency. I think you can farm wine organically or sustainably. You can use native yeast and you can use a little sulfur in your production and then still make a natural wine. And I think importantly, it's clean, it's fault free because you have a clean sanitary cellar and you are able to age it and know that every bottle is relatively consistent because of that little bit of sulfur use. And like, as someone who has worked in retail for a long time, what's critically important to me is every time I give you a bottle of wine, I know what you're going to get out of it. And I think you as a consumer probably want that too. And I don't want to work with a wine, especially shipping all the way from South Africa, where it's not super stable because it was like no sulfur, blah, blah, blah. I want to know that I can give my sommeliers and consumers a bottle and they know what they're going to get, the consumer's going to get, And I think that that's super, super, super important if you're going to spend 20, 30 plus dollars on a bottle of wine, and it can still meet the like social values and the environmental values that people want.
And so, yeah, does natural wine then? I mean, do people not like collect those as much? Is it not collectible in that way?
Well, I think the issue is that a lot of people consider natural wine is like really on the far end of the spectrum, where it's like not filtered, not fine, so super cloudy, there's no sulfur. And so those are typically not going to last like super long. But there are some like classic producers that are natural and like have been that way forever, and they are super ageable. And I think as with everything in it, it depends. But I think what I'm seeing in the natural wine world is it's mostly younger drinkers that are getting into it because they're environmentally conscious, Gen Z, millennials. They're socially, like, they have very strong social values usually, and they want to support things that they care about with their purchasing decisions. And I think natural wine, organic, green, better for you, whatever the category or the way you describe natural wines, I think that's a big element of it. And I don't know if that crowd is collecting wine as much as they're just buying to drink, So I think most of the wines people buy for collecting are like the high end, $100+ a bottle kind of wines. And I think that's a different world altogether. I mean, I think they're often natural or whatever, but it's different. It's very complicated.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to distill it down. And I think the wine industry right now is struggling to like work with natural wine because it's complicated. But on one hand, it's getting more people into drinking wine, which is a challenge. It's been a challenge. I think a lot of younger folks are not drinking. Like you just said, you don't really drink very much wine, I think a lot of younger people would rather be like on the healthier side of life or whatever, and they're not drinking wine as much. Natural wine is getting them into wine, which is crucial, right? We want more people to like find an appreciation for it and like be interested. And natural wine, I think, is doing that more than any other wine. But I think the problem is that there's a lot of misunderstandings around it and a lot of like intense, it should be no sulfur. Like, for instance, I went to a wine shop and tried to sell them wine, and they're like, I will only buy it if it's under certain parts per million of sulfur. But they couldn't explain why this level was like their most important thing. So it's just like this number that they felt was not good. It's a natural compound again. So I think what's really important is that we take that interest in the younger generation that is like, cool, I love natural wine, help them understand what it is, and then kind of help continue guiding their journey to know that like it's a very wide and all-encompassing kind of element of wine, and there's a lot of styles to it, and try to help them find more to it than just being like, I only like natural wine, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, and yeah, in some ways, it's like you said, it becomes, for most people in a busy day-to-day life, it's, we make a lot of decisions based off of headlines and TikTok videos and blogs and it's keywords and it's, I think for people who are really deep into things, it's really bothersome because it's like, oh, you're missing the point. At the same time, it's also like, well, everyone is on the wheel going round and round with their job and their family, and there's not so much time. But I mean, even the fact, like, I mean, people take sulfur supplements, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, so it's, yeah, but it's interesting because I actually do view, I mean, I view wine very much as a, if I were to drink more wine, it would be as a health supplement, essentially. Obviously I think, I would bring in the component of pleasure and community if possible. But in general, I very much view it as a medicinal thing because it's rich in all these polyphenols and antioxidants. It's just a matter of, how much are you drinking, right? It's really, but you can treat it medicinally. And for those who don't know, I mean, herbal medicine, right? Before distillation was invented, it was all done in wine for the most part. Right. So you would put your herbs and all these medicinal plants into a bottle of wine or whatever vessel, that they would use. And then you would let it extract into the wine. And that's how you had your herbal medicine. And then when they figured out like, distillation was this like, just like moment for the alchemists who created it, because it was like, whoa, we've now gotten the essence of the wine. Right. And so for them, they viewed like this distilled alcohol as like a precious gift from the gods, because now they could, you could extract medicine better. You could do all sorts of extractions way different than you could with wine. Right. Because if I have like a 14% wine, I'm only going to be able to get out a fraction of the constituents out of whatever medicinal herb that I'm looking for. But if I have a 40 or 50% distilled alcohol, now I can extract even more medicinal properties out of the plant. But it's interesting because originally all of these things, I mean, it's really modern culture that views alcohol as sometimes a potentially bad thing, right? And we think about all of these negative sides. But there's no doubt that, I mean, wine is medicinal, and you just got to find your way through it. And what is your own personal relationship with, right? It's like, hey, if you buy a bottle and it can't last more than one night, all right, let's play with that a little bit. You know what I mean? But if you can drink a glass every 3 days or, here and there, that's a fantastic thing, especially if it is having, that good medicinal polyphenol content. I mean, it's good medicine for a reason. I'll go buy a bottle of wine later, Peter. Don't
Good.
worry.
Make it
You
South
know.
African. Yeah, dude. I think.
Yeah, well, it'll be Peruvian, dog. It'll be it'd be a little expensive to find a South African wine down
Let's go.
here.
I haven't had Peruvian wine before. I want to bring one up next time you come.
I will. I mean, it's growing here, dude. I mean, everything agriculturally is booming in Peru these days. The other big one here is
Oh
pisco,
yeah.
right? Pisco is really big down here, but now the wine is becoming more and more of a thing, and I think it's decent for the price. I mean, that's a problem, right? Is when you're ignorant, it's kind of a blessing, like ignorance is bliss, so I can drink whatever they pretty much give me, and I'm like, yeah, this is great. And so it would be fun. I'll bring you some bottles next time I come home, that way you can give the
Cool.
proper tasting
Yeah,
to
cool,
it.
man.
um
Yeah, and I'll say
so
like to kind of wrap up on the natural thing, like for me with culture wine, and I think what the message I try to really like get through when I meet with sommeliers or consumers that are really like hardcore about natural wine, but it's again this confusing thing. I think for me what's really important is our people, supporting good people, hardworking people that are doing it the right way. And so to me that is like, again, I think it's important to find producers that are not spraying a lot in the vineyard or not spraying at all, like herbicides, pesticides, using regenerative agriculture, dry farming as much as possible, and then clean cellars. Native yeast is important, but I'm totally down with the little sulfur because I do want to see wines evolve in a bottle and have consistency. And so all those things from a production point of view are important. But at the same time, like in South Africa in particular, I see people fight through adversity more than any region I've been to by far. I like in any given day, there's usually something called load shedding where the government shuts down power for anywhere between 2 and sometimes 12 hours. So that is very challenging when you're trying to run a winery, especially during harvest or bottling time. There's no subsidies there, like there are in the EU for grape growing and winemaking. Sometimes in the EU, there's even like rebates on bottles sold, and none of that exists in South Africa. And beyond that, like just the general pay per year is challenging. So there's not a lot of money to reinvest back into the wine, buy new oaks. So it's mostly neutral barrels, and people share equipment a lot. And I think the things that people go through in a given day, in a given year there are so extreme. And like that's what I'm supporting more so than like natural or whatever box it fits into. That is so important to me, and that's like what I like to talk about more is like I'm just like so impressed and respect what these producers are doing. And I think that is really the key to me is the people behind the wine more than anything else.
Yeah, and it's it's interesting because there is, like you said, I mean, like the electricity challenge. I mean, that could be devastating when you have this schedule, right? When you're talking about, it's like, hey, if we wait another couple of days, what happens to sugar and acid if the heat spikes, but all of a sudden, like, electricity's out, And I believe, right? I mean, South Africa is also having some pretty gnarly
Yeah.
water issues now in the cities,
Yeah,
right?
water is a big problem there. I think Mexico City, Rio, and Johannesburg are all towns that have like very serious water restrictions right now. And yeah, I mean that's a real big issue. And it's another thing. South Africans, the wine industry, obviously can use a lot of water. But I think what's phenomenal about what I'm seeing in so many, especially the producers I work with, is that they're dry farmed. And so that will assuredly make your yields lower because, if you can't pump it with water, it's just not going to grow as much. You're not going to get as fat of berries. But if you're producing quality wine, right, then that's the point. And so for me to support these producers that are not taking water from the municipalities to grow their grapes and dry farming, that's just like another element of the quality that they're doing. It's another incredibly important piece of the story, and it's like I'm so stoked to support that.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, for anyone who's not in agriculture, when I look at like U.S. agriculture, and this isn't. I mean, I love my farmers, but you got to be real at a certain point, and it's like a lot of these guys are kind of, you're just very out of touch with the natural world in ways. I mean, they still check the weather, they still do all these things, and Mother Nature is still very much involved. But there's a big difference when you're dry land farming and the only rain and water you're going to get is whatever the sky gives you. And you don't have a pump where you're just going to start pumping out of the ground or from a canal instantly. And it's a completely different type of experience and challenge set. And you're right, dude. It's absolutely impressive. It's also a massive roller coaster. I mean, regular farming is a roller coaster, but this type of farming is even bigger. And I agree. I do think that's where the story in lies every year, and that's what makes it so difficult yet so rewarding, is to see because really it's like, what did we produce together with Mother Nature this year? Like, what came of it? You know what I mean? At the end of the year, and like, how did we adapt and respond to the given conditions? But you're not necessarily strong arming nature like a lot of modern Western farming does, right? It's like, hey, I don't care what's happening next week. I'm planting my seed in the ground with my digital tractor, and I'm gonna put water on it immediately, pump it out of the ground. Like, it's a completely different type of experience, and one to definitely be respected to another degree. I couldn't agree more. It's super cool. So tell us, I mean, what exactly is Culture Wines? What are you guys doing? What's the fundamental of that kind of venture?
Yeah. So it's just me for now. I hope I can grow it to be a team, but right now I'm the bookkeeper, I'm the admin, I'm the sales guy, I'm the janitor. I started. I went to South Africa in 2023 and was like completely enamored. Um, I got inspired like beyond belief when I went there, because I went just on a holiday. I had left a job that I was in an executive role and was just like burning the candle at both ends and so stressed and burnt out. And finally was able to travel to the other side of the world with like complete mental freedom. And when I was there, I ended up at a wine fair and I met nearly 30 producers. I tasted every single wine there, and it just like blew my mind. My perception of what South African wine was relative to what it actually is was completely different. And that's because what we see here in the US, what we've seen has been the more like large scale brands that are kind of the opposite of what we're talking about, where they're doing more irrigation, more spraying, more, they're built to export around the world. But these small minimal intervention producers were like mind-blowingly good, and I had never heard of any of them. And so I basically came home and was so inspired by that trip. I was like, I want to import these. I'm ready to start my own business. I don't think there's much of these in the market. Let me do research. And the research backed it up. And there's less than 1% of all wine imported into the US is from South Africa. And so I was like, this is crazy. These producers are so supportive of one another. They're making incredible stuff. Like, I'm gonna do this. And so I went back a few months later. I pitched several producers to work with me and let me be their US importer. And I ended up partnering with 9 producers to import 22 wines from them. And so I import and wholesale throughout California. And then I have an online retail store and like wine club, and I ship to 44 states in the US. And, like I said earlier, it's the Culture Wine Company is the only importer, wholesaler, and retailer in the US that focuses just on South African wine. So wildly underrepresented. I started the company to just be like a conduit for their stories, for the winemaker stories. And so I try to work with as many women-owned and Black-owned wineries as I can, still And even in South Africa, where a large majority of the population is Black, you see very little Black winemakers or Black ownership. And so my goal is to try to bring as many Black and women-owned brands as possible, or at least winemakers as possible, into the U.S. and try to tell their stories and give more of a platform and share their stories. And so I got my first container into the U.S. in November of 2023. I've almost sold that in the first 5 months of being in operation, and have another one leaving South Africa actually this week. So it's been successful. It's been working. It's definitely really hard. A large part of my day on the wholesale side is like reaching out to sommeliers and wine buyers and be like, hey, this is what I started. This is the story of South Africa. I promise you it's not the large, high alcohol, super oaky wine you think they are. They're light, they're fresh, they're mineral, they're organic, sustainably farmed wines. Please give me 30 minutes to taste, and let me try to change your perspective, or at least set a foundation of what's happening there. And I have a not as large of a success rate as I would like, but I think it'll happen with time. I think as more people, what I'm seeing is that when I do have an appointment with the sommelier or a wine buyer, they're every single appointment I've left with now has been like, whoa, when I'm walking out the door, like, this was really eye-opening. Like, what's happening there, like, it is really high quality. It is fresh. It is exactly what I'm looking for. And it has been completely changed what I thought South African wine was for the better. So as more people and sommeliers taste and have that realization, they'll talk to other people in the industry. And I think my mission of trying to get more people into South African wine is happening like one buyer at a time. But the reaction has been what I've hoped it would be, almost entirely across the board, and which shows me that it's possible, right? And it's just a matter of like continuing to beat the drum and keep getting more people to try the wine.
Right. So that's awesome. So when you like once you get the meeting, typically then the wine will speak for itself in combination with the stories that you have to share. When you said like maybe you don't have as many as you would like, is the strike rate, is like the phone call to the tasting quite a bit of a challenge?
Yeah, so basically, like, for me, what's important is not to get into the largest retailers and restaurants, to get into the restaurants and retailers that are like me, right? That are storytellers, they're brand builders, they care about the product, they care about the people. But, those places are highly sought after by every importer. And like I said earlier, California, we're very lucky to have some incredible importers here. But it means there's a lot of competition for me now, right? And so on one hand, we're all kind of in it together trying to develop a really strong wine industry here with a lot of diversity, but it means buyers are getting barraged with people like me trying to share really cool stuff. And so I'm emailing and I'm trying not to be too bothersome, but I'm basically saying like, hey, like, this is a story, and I'm actually down to even come share it with you just from an educational point of view. Like, you don't have to put it on your list, but I guarantee you're going to try this Pinotage, or you're going to try this Chenin Blanc, and it's going to change your perception on South African wine. And even if I do that, even if you don't buy it, but now you say like, oh, dude, there's actually cool shit happening there, that's still a win. And so for me, that's kind of more important, because as someone who's a wine educator who, like, it's so important for me to try to teach and educate, and my sales meetings are more like educational meetings than they are like, buy this at this price and I'll give you this deal. That's more important. And so the more people that just come on board and at least say like, yeah, dude, eye opening, really cool. I appreciate what you're doing, and we'll keep chatting. That's a win. You know what I mean? Because in the end, like, I'm like an informal ambassador to South Africa and their wine. And that's, so anytime someone's perception changes, that's exactly what the goal is.
Right. Yeah, you're probably the most formal ambassador actually with the wine.
Maybe. Yeah.
um, so then what happens, right? Like you go to this, educational tasting sales meeting, and then these are sommeliers. Like, where are they working? Are they a sommelier for like a store or for a restaurant, or like what is their role?
Yeah, it's a mix of both. So I have this list that I mentioned, and I'm basically just focusing on trying to get in with them. And it's because I want them to be storytellers like I am. And so these folks are either running wine programs or they're running retail stores or wine bars. And so I have, like I said, I have 22 wines, and I'll usually bring like five or six. I'll often bring like rocks from the vineyards because I think it's, for some reason, like all the wine people, including myself, we like love rocks. We're like we're like, oh, cool. This is sandstone. This is quartz. This is, granite. And for some reason, we're all like very informal, uneducated geologists. Um, and so I'll bring maps, I'll bring pictures, videos, like whatever I can to bring the producer in the region to the buyer. Because I think South Africa in particular is so wildly beautiful. It's actually very similar to California in climate and topography. So when you start to see some of these things, you're like, oh, it kind of reminds me of home. And then the barrier kind of drops a little bit, which I think is important. And yeah, and just, chat with them. Like, also learn, like, what works well for you? What doesn't? Just why do you not have any South African wine on your list? What's your perception of South Africa? All this stuff is good for me to know and to learn. And even the buyers who are like, you know what, like, it's cool, but I'm not gonna buy it. Um, this wine isn't gonna work for me. I still like to ask, like, why? You know what I mean? Because that's good information. And so anytime we can just have like conversations where we're both learning from one another, it's great. It's helpful.
Yeah, yeah. I imagine it's like that would be an interesting challenge with just knowing how many different growing regions, and I'm sure there's trends during the year, every year, of kind of where people's perception is going, and so that I'm sure there's a lot of different parameters of why they would do that. Yeah, super interesting. It's a much different world than a lot of agriculture commodities for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's a
Yeah,
lifestyle product, man. It's really what it's all about.
yeah. And so you started this, so you import, you do e-commerce, you do retail, distribution to retail. Um, tell us about some of your favorite farms, your favorite founder stories. I mean, you've got some amazing stories on the website of different vineyards. Tell us about some of those.
Yeah, man. It's hard to pick uh, uh, just a couple,
Tell us
but
about the 20. Tell us about the woman who was like 26 years old when
yeah,
she became like that. That's an interesting one.
yeah. I was going to mention her and another one. So there's two that I would quickly talk about. One is Brookdale Estate, and it is made by a producer named Chiara Scott Farmer. Chiara is a badass. She grew up in a township. So in South Africa, you still have a very strong legacy of apartheid. It's very real. It's gonna take generations for it to be unraveled. It's very challenging. And townships are very much a legacy of apartheid. And so she grew up in one. And most families there are not into alcohol because they've seen alcohol tear apart so many families, right? So it's rare to see someone want to work in alcohol coming from that world. But Chiara was very interested in it. And so she enrolled in Elsenburg, which is a great winemaking school there, and then was brought into this amazing program called the Protege program. And this program brings in like 7 to 9 recipients a year. It is a paid internship, and it puts them in a 3-year program where they do 1-year internships at 3 different wineries, right? So at the third year, she ended up at this very new estate called Brookdale, which I now import. And she was working under one of the most famous winemakers who was consulting for them. His name was Duncan Savage. And basically, by the end of this internship, she had done such a great job and proven herself so well that she took over the head winemaking role. Duncan went off to focus on his own label. And Chiara became the youngest head female winemaker in the country at only 26. And so to come from a township a non-alcohol drinking family all the way to be the youngest head female winemaker is like, the odds of that are very low. But when you meet her, you can totally see why. Like, she's ultra charismatic. She's incredibly talented. Every year her wines are getting better. She's just a total rock star. And she's inspiring so many more young Black women to get into winemaking. And there are more women, more people of color getting into the Protege program, getting into winemaking in South Africa. And it's just a great thing. And I think Chiara is very much an inspiration for a lot of folks to do that. And then there's another winery called Scions of Sinai that I work with. And that is owned by a 7th generation grape grower and winemaker named Bernard Brudel. And Bernard is like, the guy is just eats, sleeps, and breathes this land. So basically, there's a little area of Stellenbosch called the Helderberg, and it's right on the water. So it's quite cool relative to the rest of that region. And so that he makes more like elegant, kind of almost salty, like very mineral wines, red and white. But the land that he farms is owned by his cousin. And the short story is that his family used to own a couple hundred acres, and his dad ended up having to sell like what would have been inherited by him after just some kind of sad industry related issues. And now what's left in his family is owned by his cousin. But Bernard does the farming for him. He brokers grape deals. He works his ass off to keep this land dry farmed, regenerative, bush vines, and ensuring that it stays as high a quality as its potential, and it doesn't get sold into, bigger bulk producers or whatever. And so he makes these incredible wines from this vineyard, and in particular this grape called Pinotage, which has had I think a challenging reputation. And his wine is completely game changer for this grape variety. And so like, when I walk the vineyards with Bernard, I'm like blown away by his passion, his knowledge, his like, he's just one of those people you're just like magnetized to with how incredibly talented he is. And then you taste the wines and they're like, everyone who's tasting them has been like blown away by them. It's been some of my fastest selling wine along with Chiara's at Brookdale. And, it's all about the amazing people behind these very high quality wines. It's been awesome to represent them.
That is amazing. You mentioned the name of a grape, Pinotage, if I'm pronouncing it right. I'd like to learn more about that side of things because, coming from Bakersfield, California, right? Like that's where the cotton candy grape was invented, right? The table grape. And actually, I think both. I mean, by far, the number one like grape genetics company is in Kern County in Bakersfield, and I actually think the second largest was also there at some point. But tell us a little bit about that side of. I mean, are these wines coming from South Africa? Are they the same type of grapes that you're going to find in pretty much every other region that you would expect around the world that produce wines, or are there some unique grapes to that area? And like, when did they get there, and kind of tell us the story of that?
Yeah. So South Africa just had its 365th winemaking, anniversary. Grapes are not indigenous to South Africa. There are no indigenous grapes like in Italy or Portugal or Greece. So grapes are all brought there by colonizers. The history of South Africa is very much tied to colonization. And that's something for me that's important to talk about. I don't want to shy away from like the real dark history of the country. But I think what the potential of the wine industry today for South Africans and for the economy and for upward trajectory of growth out of challenging situations, I think is amazing. So I think it's important to talk about the history of colonization, but also like what grapes can do for so many there. So there's a lot of French varieties. You see a lot of Syrah, Chenin Blanc, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Cabernet. But then there's this grape called Pinotage. Pinotage is a cross of two grapes. It's a cross of a grape called Pinot Noir, which most people are familiar with, and then another one called Cinsault, which many people don't know about. And Cinsault is originally from southern France, and it's typically a grape that, in its best examples, can be like kind of wild red fruits and like kind of almost a little bit bitter in the finish. And so Pinotage is a cross of those two grapes, and that was created in South Africa in the 1920s. And I think that for decades, it's been made in a way where it is high alcohol, a lot of new oak, kind of intense. But Pinot Noir and Cinsault as grapes are much better when they're treated kind of more delicately, right? And lower alcohol and try to enhance the aromatics. And I think that in the last 15 or so years, you've seen producers start to treat it that way, and it's changing the whole philosophy of the grape. So, like, for instance, Bernard at Science of Sinai, he makes a Pinotage that's grown from like a mile from the ocean, so cool climate. It's grown in sandy silica soil. It's old bush vines that are dry farmed, so low yield. And he only does stainless steel. So that preserves aromatics, and it helps it so it stays fresher and like juicier. And so when I bring that wine to sommeliers and wine buyers who have read about Pinotage or have had examples that are more like high alcohol and intense, they see it and they're like, oh no, you brought me Pinotage. And then they taste it and like, oh shit, this is incredible. I didn't know it could be like this. And I think that is the future of that grape. And actually, Bernard's Pinotage, the one that I'm talking about, which is called Atlanticus, it's like $20 on my website. It's part of the reason why I even started the company, because I was on the fence about it, about South Africa. Like, can I sell this? It's a tough sell. People don't know about it. People want Italian, they want French. Am I going to be able to like open eyes and doors with these wines, you know? And then I tasted this Pinotage and was like, holy shit, I'm all in. I'm starting this company. And it's because it is something that's unique to South Africa. It is an entirely new direction for the grape. And I think it has that wow factor to it to start making people think differently and feel differently about it. So yeah, Pinotage is, you don't see it really anywhere else in the world. And I think it's just really found its footing in this style.
Interesting. Yeah. Interesting how it could be a grape that's been around for, 100 years, but then just because of how it's been, produced, then it hasn't been appealing. And now that can change. That is fascinating. So what about, are there any other unique varieties to like that have been, bred in South Africa that you're really excited and interested in as well, or is it mostly just that one?
Well, no, there's a ton. I think there's none other that were like crossings that were made there. However, they grow Chenin Blanc, which is originally from the Loire Valley, but they grow so much of it now that if you add up all of the acreage around the world and combine it, there's still not as much as is in South Africa. And so it is their white grape. And it is a fucking awesome wine. Like, it is a grape variety that expresses its terroir or its kind of origin, probably as well as any grape in the world. So, like, if you're growing it in the Swartland, which is hot, arid, and really hard schist soil, which means the vines really struggle to dig deep, which means a smaller canopy, which means less fruit and more intense fruit. If you have it from there versus a cool climate further east in what's called the Walker Bay, which gives you a little bit more linear kind of like acid driven wines, you have the exact same grape, two radically different styles. So what I want to do as I grow my portfolio is be able to bring in several Chenin Blancs so I can tell that story and eventually be like, okay, sommelier, like, you love Loire Valley Chenin Blanc. Well, yeah, Vouvray and Anjou and Savennières, which are all in Loire, all have different soil and different styles of Chenin. Well, the Swartland, Walker Bay, and Stellenbosch also have similar radically different styles of Chenin. So let's talk about that. Right. And that's my goal. So I basically built my portfolio now to have just a little touch of each style and region. And now I want to kind of start developing depth within all that breadth. Chenin is a grape that does that. I think Syrah is phenomenal out of there. So Syrah is originally from the Rhone Valley in France. It is a pretty chameleon-like variety, just like Chenin, where it can grow in cool climates, it can grow in warm climates, it can grow in a variety of different soils. But I think its best examples come from kind of extreme areas where the soils are poor and you really stress the hell out of the vines. And South Africa can do that. It's very sunny, it can be very warm, not a lot of rain. So you can find places where it struggles and you can make great Syrah. So I make that same producer, Bernard. He has a very cool climate, Syrah, grown a mile from the ocean. These bush vines, epic wine. Like it tastes to me like something from the Northern Rhone from some of the best producers. And I've seen sommeliers as well be like, whoa, this is really serious wine. And then, and that's like $40. That's like 1/5 the cost of these Northern Rhone Syrahs that I'm talking about. And then you go to another area called Bot River, and I import one from a producer called Luddite Wines, also dry farmed, but different kind of richer soil. And these are pretty powerful, bulky Syrahs, but still super elegant. And so it's another grape that like grows in a lot of different parts of South Africa and creates such different styles no matter where it is. And I think that, you know, that is really what I'm talking about when I talk to sommeliers or consumers is like, even if you have Syrah, Chenin, Pinotage, Cabernet, it expresses itself so differently between the different regions that you can actually like really dive in and like it can be super interesting, even if you're trying the same grape from a lot of different places.
Yeah. That you mentioned, so that everything that you just talked about right there in terms of like being next to the ocean or this really hot region or the soil here, that is what you would reference as terroir. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like kind
Yep.
of all of the different climatic factors in combination would be what you would call terroir for a plant.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, you know, it's interesting. I think right now there's been some kind of theories that terroir doesn't really exist, that it's actually winemaker or grape grower and winemaker. But I think in South Africa, you have either granite or you have sandstone or you have schist soils and then some variations of those usually. And if you have schist in a warm climate, it creates a very different wine than you have sandstone in a cool climate. And so, yeah, as I'm learning more about the different soils of the different regions, you can start to see through lines. But for me, in South Africa, some of the through lines that I see, regardless of where the grapes are grown, is there's often this beautiful like salinity in the wines, which seems kind of weird, but it's like, in particular, the grapes that are grown near the coast, like the mid palate finish of the wine can have salinity to it. It's really interesting. And in some cases, there's even like this kind of kelpiness, this like salty kind of oceanicness to some of the Syrahs that I get as well. And it sounds weird when you try it. It adds this element of nuance and depth that is just like so beautiful and I think really unique to South Africa. And so you could say that there's a salinity to some of the wines, and that is some of the terroir of South Africa. And it just keeps, you can keep going down the list of different parts that are like that.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that there is going to be quite a bit of, different theories on that moving forward. I was just reading like 3 weeks ago how essentially they tested and they're like, oh yeah, actually like the genetics of this tea is not as important for flavor expression as the microbial communities that were active in that soil. And I think that is going to, I think we would be foolish to think that it's one thing, right? Like this is that old reductionist thinking of, it's like, well, there's only one thing contributing to this flavor, but it's like, yeah, it's going to be the wind and the breeze in that region. And it's going to be the amount of sunlight and the different soil. but I do firmly believe that like the microbial population is going to probably show to be the most important one, because it's the microbes who are able to go and actually fetch all of the minerals and things that the plant can't reach, right? Like plants don't walk, right? So that's what the microbial communities and the plants are doing. The plant is saying, hey, I'm going to trade you these sugars and starches that I'm going to produce through my photosynthesis. And you guys bring me like the copper and the, the selenium, like all these things that I can't reach with my roots. You go collect them, bring them to my root, and then I'll trade you this sugar for it. And
Yeah.
that's why having these robust microbial communities, which is, a foundation of regenerative agriculture, is that all of a sudden you do find like, oh wait, this fruit has way more flavor complexity because it's getting all the micronutrients, whereas traditional, let's not call it traditional, let's call it petrochemical industrial agriculture complex, right? Which says like, well, you just need nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus, these three main ones, and don't worry about the rest of the things, and then you end up with fruit like, dude, I can't even begin to tell you the first bell pepper that I cut into when I came back to the US a couple months ago. I was like, this is just water. There's nothing in here.
Yeah.
I was shocked. Yeah. And just coming back to Peru and just seeing like the depth of color, the smell as soon as I cut it, the taste, but also seeing that it wasn't just this watery, fake vegetable thing that was just pumped with the basic synthetic things. It's a totally different experience. And I think that's going to be really exciting to see how much flavor actually changes, especially as these vineyards approach more and more regenerative, because, a large part of that is the microbial communities will change dramatically, but it takes time, right? It takes you about 3 to 5 years to really get the system going. And then it's going to be quite fascinating to see what kind of flavors are produced.
Yeah, dude, totally. Bernard walked me through a vineyard that he and another couple of winemakers decided to basically buy to convert to regenerative. And it's like on top of the hill of where his existing regenerative vines are that are flourishing. And this one is like, they're bush vines. So they're only like 2 feet off the ground. So they're very, very hard to farm. They're not trellised high up to make your life easier and to make yields higher. They're bush vines that are like sprawling. And so you have to plant, you get less of them in an acre, which makes your yield lower. They naturally yield lower per plant. So even more, reduced per acre. But again, the quality is immense. But we went to this new one that he's going to convert. It's going to take him at least 5 years. And you could just see the difference. Like they didn't look healthy. They looked scraggy. They just needed help. And so I'm so stoked to watch this year by year evolution of this vineyard, because he's going to make it like the healthiest version that it can be. And then it's regenerative. It's helping itself, right? It's like it's standing on its own 2 feet. And it's not BS when it comes to the wine, because you taste wine from vineyards like that and you can taste concentration. So like you're saying, where you cut into a bell pepper and it's just like a crunch and there's no real like there. It's just kind of this like wannabe flavor of pepper. And then you taste one that's like organically farmed and you're like, oh, it's just like a complete game changer. It's the same thing with wine. You taste it and you're like, the flavor lasts for a long time. There's a ton of different flavors. It's just so clear when you have something that's like mass produced to something that's made by hand and lower yielding. It's truly like night and day. There's no similarities at all.
Yeah, no, it's exciting, dude. It's really exciting to see. I guess, because we've been in so much of that, petro ag system where we have had so many agriculture products that have been just like this diluted version that people 150 years ago would have been like, what the hell are you guys eating? This is trash, and that like we're approaching the opportunity to kind of come back to to some of that, just complexity and the dimension that it provides, right? There's so much more dimension provided with all the flavor and the experience. And, we're right in the midst of that transition. So it is cool. And I'm super pumped, I'm really pumped that you're doing, that as a core of this business and the selection of the vineyards, because I do think that is important, not only from a flavor taste, point of view, but also just, how are we, treating this earth moving forward. And so it's cool to hear that you're doing that. So any tips as we close for like, not even South African. We're not going to let you have your own, we'll do all your website and stuff. We'll post all the links, and people should definitely go, get some wines and have that experience. And just to say, like, I think that's also one of the coolest things, right, of today. It's like, you can cultivate your own kind of like world experience at home, and a lot of times better than you might actually do traveling in some ways, right? Like, you could decide to like make a South African meal with that South African wine that you ordered, and put on some South African music and just immerse yourself. You know what I mean? Like, that is something that is a lot of fun that I've, gotten into in the past years, of just when I didn't cook before, dude. Like, I didn't grow up in a household where like you learn how to cook. When I lived in India, I had a private chef because I was working like 7 days a week. And then again, it was herbalism that was like, wait a second, like, I can cook food medicinally, and there's a whole method to this. And that got me into cooking, but it's really just connected me so much deeper to just cultures in general and flavor and experience. And now I look back, I'm like, dude, you've traveled to so many countries, and I almost need to go back just to do food tours.
Yeah.
Like, purely, like, I would base, like, I am basing my future travel more around like food and drink than anything else, because I find that it is, like, the coolest thing. But what would you say are like some very basic, like, here's what you should look for when you're buying a bottle of wine?
Oh, um,
Gen Z, millennial. How about
yeah,
for me?
that's a tough one. I think I, I, what would you look for? I mean, I think that I think a lot of people these days are looking for like lower alcohol styles of wine and like fresher. So I think like oftentimes you can go to like, if you look at an area that's typically a little warmer climate, like South Africa, for instance, and you see something that's like 12.5 to 13% alcohol, sometimes that can be an indicator that the wine is like, they're really trying to make it in a fresher style, which would mean that they're really caring for the fact that it's not getting like overripe, and just like there's a lot of thought put into the when the grape should be picked. So that's sometimes a good way to look at it. I think on a more granular level, in the U.S., every wine that's imported has to have on the back label who it's imported by. And I think if you can learn a few importers that you like, then you can kind of look for that on the wine. So you go to a retail store and you're like, oh, cool, I've seen like imported by Culture Wine Company on a lot of these bottles. I dig what that importer is typically bringing in. They've got a palette that I like. And so I think if people start to pay attention to the back labels of what they like, see who's importing the wine, and then kind of follow them, that'll usually open their palate by a pretty substantial margin. It also helps if they follow that to then go to a retailer and say, hey, I really liked Scions of Sinai, imported by Culture Wine Company. Can you try and find that wine? And then it helps the buyer know how to track it down. Because oftentimes, as like a retail buyer, you'll be like, a person will come in and be like, hey, have you heard of winery X, Y, and Z? And then you like you can't really find out how to figure out who's importing it. Whereas like if you can give that information to the retail buyer, then they'll be able to find the wine for you in like 5 seconds. So
Gotcha.
so yeah, that's an easy way to like just pay attention to importer, and usually you'll start to find some pretty interesting kind of through lines.
And then the easiest way would just be to get a subscription from Culture Wine Co.
Yeah,
Right? That way
yeah,
it's coming no matter what, and you're gonna get some different stuff, I imagine.
yeah. 2 bottles a month shipped to you for no additional charge of shipping. It's like duh, just do that. You don't have to leave your house.
Yeah. Yeah. Why do any research until we need to?
Yeah.
Um, does that come with a music playlist at all?
So I do 2 bottles every month for $69 and it's free shipping. And then you get like 10% off the website always. And if you decide you want to add bottles to that month's shipment, that will ship for free with the bottles plus 10% off. And then I record a video or like 3 to 5 minutes, talk about the wines or like the through line. So this upcoming month will be 2 Syrahs from South Africa. And so I'll talk more about like what is Syrah, where did it come from, and what are the 2 styles you have. And then I'll usually put on like some South African music in the video and then like put a credit to it. Um, but yeah, dude, like I have a playlist on my Spotify called Songs of South Africa. I have it on my Culture Wine Co Instagram, like in the link tree. And yeah, for me, like music is a big part of my life. I love discovering music. When I travel places, I travel for food, wine, and music. That is like the 3 things I travel for. And so I always try to bring back music. I keep adding to that playlist. And dude, South Africa has some incredible music. So it's fun to explore
Definitely.
that and share it. You know that.
Yeah. No, it was hilarious. Yeah. I mean, I think that was like one of the first moments where we probably like first connected at the bachelor party was it was funny because 3 days before that I was in the car like playing Sun El Musician for Pete in the car. And then when you were walking up, because like I'm always trying to probe those guys, right? It's because like these guys are all producing some of the bigger songs happening now, and like they're all in the music scene, and so I'm always trying to like plug in these little tidbits. And so I already talked to a couple different guys, and then I turn over and you're like pumping Sun El Musician as well, and I was like, what? You know what I mean? Because like honestly, I haven't met a single DJ. I haven't met anyone who knows about this guy, and it's some of the most beautiful music that I've ever heard. And so that might actually have to be one of our trips these days. Like I would love to. It'd be an expensive trip, but I would love to go to a like an African music festival. But Sun El Musician would have to be playing for me to be there. But as long as he's playing, then like I'm there for sure.
Dude, well, yeah. So South Africa has amazing music, and it's also like obviously from Peru, it's not easy. I mean, flying from Mexico was gnarly. I can't even imagine from Peru to South Africa. But if you can make it, like it's a long journey, but if you can make it to South Africa, it's very affordable, and you can definitely travel on a budget. You can ball out and still be very reasonable, but what you get for your money there is epic. And the hospitality is genuine and warm. Their culture is rich. It's super inviting. People are supportive. It's a beautiful place to travel, and it's safe. It's got like everything you want, and it's outrageously beautiful. Like one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in the world. And that's like not just Cape Town. It's like the entire Western Cape just keeps unfolding and like giving you more beautiful things. So it's a place you should definitely try to go. And like whether it's you or a listener, like can always hit me up, and I'm so happy to help with an itinerary. On my blog, on my website, I have like a wineries and restaurants to visit in South Africa, so you can always hit that up. It's just a list right now, but I eventually want it to be more like day by day. But at the least, it's a start. But I want people to have a good time there, so anything I can do, like I'm here for it.
That's awesome. Yeah, we'll have to figure it out. One of these days, I would, maybe I'll tag along on a trip, go see some vineyards, and eat some awesome food,
Yeah, dude.
see some music, and drink some wine. That would be absolutely fantastic. Well, all right, brother man. Total pleasure to see you here today. Get to spend a little bit of time learning more about what the world you're in, and yeah, it's, appreciate it so much. Appreciate what you're doing, and keep rocking. Keep after those sommeliers and those those people. Keep educating, and I'll check in with you at some point soon.
Yeah, thanks, dude. I appreciate you having me on, man. I appreciate it. We'll see you soon.